Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Arrington, and I am the Chief Mortgage Operations Officer at North State Bank. I'd like to thank Ken, Scott, and Katie for that great information they shared with us. We've had a terrific opening day of the conference and have touched on some really valuable topics. Welcome to Session 4, A View from the Top, How Industry Financial Players See the Role of eMortgages in the Marketplace and in the Future. During this session, you will get to hear from Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta as we discuss the current and future roles of eMortgages. I would like to introduce our panelists. From Fannie Mae, we have Shane Hartzler, Director for Closing Solutions. In this role, he leads strategy execution in the design, development, and improvement of digital closing and delivery solutions. Shane partners with customers and industry stakeholders to evaluate market needs and identify opportunities to drive adoption and support deliveries of digital mortgages. From Freddie Mac, we have Raj Penugonda, an eMortgage program lead in Freddie's single-family division. He is responsible for managing and improving the eMortgage program. In addition to identifying and managing internal strategic initiatives, he works closely with various industry stakeholders to increase eMortgage adoption. From the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta, we have Kent Scott, who directs collateral management services. In his role, Kent manages the types of collateral accepted by the bank and works with the bank's shareholders to help them maximize value from their eligible collateral. I'd like to ask each of our three panelists for their unique perspective on the state of eMortgage adoption in the mortgage industry. Can you each talk a little about that and also discuss where you see adoption heading? Shane, I'll start with you.
Hey, thanks, Kelly. That's a great question. So I'd love to talk a little bit about sort of where we are with eMortgage adoption in the industry. I think actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to give sort of a high-level overview of where we've been, and then I'll let Raj highlight what we're seeing in terms of volumes and some of the adoption statistics. So first, though, I thought it would be good to provide a bit in terms of some definitions, just so we're clear on what we're talking about. So, when we talk about eMortgages, what we really mean there is that the note primarily is being signed electronically. In a hybrid closing, some of the docs are going to be signed in paper, others are going to be signed electronically. Usually when I say hybrid, that I'm assuming there in those instances that the note is being signed in paper. And then we have the full digital closings, right? That's really what we're pursuing from an industry. That's kind of the goal. Those digital closings can be done both in person or remotely, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. When we think about eMortgages, they've been around for almost 20 years. And in fact, Kelly, I've got some things here. I don't know if you guys can see this. So these are videotapes that we put out. One of them, it says 2002. One of them says 2001. What's interesting, if you look at some of the value props that we have on here and some of the marketing that we were doing, a lot of those same value props are things that we're going to talk about today, right? In terms of better borrower experience, where I can, preview the documents, you can close at home, you have time savings, you can eliminate the confusion, as well as some of the operational pickups that we talk about, right? So better data, no missing signatures. I mean, we've been highlighting a lot of those benefits for years, and I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot of them today. But adoption, as we think about over the last 20 years, was really from a handful of lenders, and it was largely a niche product. So what that meant was there was never more than maybe 4 or 5 lenders who were doing eMortgage. They were doing it maybe for some customers, and again, they were generating from some fairly significant volumes, but it was never something where we were seeing it where it was becoming part of the mainstream. It was always just a couple of lenders that were doing that. And so I think now what we're starting to see is that it is becoming more part of the mainstream, and I think that's really important for adoption, right? Because it's critical if you're going to be able to take advantage of eMortgage, if you're going to be able to take advantage of the benefits that it's going to provide to you. You have to be able to incorporate that into your workflow, right? It has to be part of the core process. It can't be a niche product. And I think that's one of the other things that I think I would say before I turn it over to Raj is, traditionally what we've been saying to lenders is, hey, you can pursue like the hybrid approach. Maybe even makes sense to pursue that hybrid approach, right? Like start with your lender disclosure, start with some of your ancillary documents, right? Look to them to sort of, sign ahead, give the borrower a chance to sign ahead in the process, and then focus later on some of the notarized documents. And I think, that approach, that hybrid approach is really good in that it allows lenders to look at their processes, to think about sort of what the workflow is going to be, any of those things. However, what it doesn't do is it doesn't allow a lender to take advantage of the eNote and take advantage of some of the benefits that you're going to have there. In particular, some of the delivery and funding benefits, as well as some of the remote closing options that a lot of lenders are looking for now, particularly now in the time of COVID, right? And so the one sort of piece of advice that I've been giving to lenders as we think about adoption, as we think about sort of where we're going in the industry, is really start to think about putting in place capabilities to generate, to sign, to store, and to transmit the eNote, right? Because the title community is going to have the ability to put in place, options for borrowers when it comes to signing a lot of the other documents. But the one thing that the title community can't solve for is the note. And so that's where the lenders really need to focus on that and have some of those capabilities. So that again is where, like I said, that's sort of the historical view of where we are with eMortgages. I'll turn it back over to you, Kelly, and I think Raj is going to talk a little bit more in terms of what we're seeing now, what have we seen in terms of the volumes and some of those statistics.
Thanks, Shane. Raj, can you give us your thoughts?
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thanks to North Carolina Secretary of State's office for this opportunity. And Kelly, with regards to your question, e-mortgage adoption has been steadily increasing over the last couple of years, both from a number of lenders standpoint as well as from a volume standpoint. And COVID-19 pandemic has led to further increase in this adoption. Just to share some numbers with you, from a Freddie Mac standpoint, we have approved more lenders to deliver e-mortgages to us this year than last 2 years combined. And industry has originated more than 350,000 e-mortgages this year, representing a growth of more than 265% compared to last year. And we see similar trends in the state of North Carolina as well. And use of remote online notary technology has grown by more than 1,000% in the closing transactions because there is a greater demand from both consumer standpoint as well as from a settlement agent standpoint to conduct contactless closings. The entry of Ginnie Mae federal home loan banks into the space, I believe, will spur the adoption, even more. While COVID-19 pandemic has caused a hockey stick movement in the adoption of e-mortgage process, I see this as a more of a permanent shift in the closing transaction, meaning that I would see more and more closings being conducted this way as opposed to the traditional way of doing a paper-based closing. Back to you, Kelly.
Thank you, Raj. That was great. Kent, can you share your perspective on this topic?
Hi, Kelly. The Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta has been talking with numerous banks and credit unions over the last 10, if not 15 years on the topic of e-mortgages. And for most of that time, the conversation has been one where our members would reach out to us to ask, are you accepting e-mortgages? And we would tell them at the time that we were not and why. And they generally would say, well, okay, that's fine. But we noticed over the last couple of years that the interest from our members started to ramp up. And so there are 10 other federal home loan banks within the system that cover the balance of the country. The Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta covers the Southeast, and these other 10 home loan banks cover the balance of the country. And the credit and collateral officers from all 11 home loan banks will periodically get together and talk about issues and topics that are current and relevant to credit and collateral. And we noticed over the last couple of years that many of our members across the country were asking about this topic. They were asking about e-mortgages. And so as we started noticing that, we all agreed that while we didn't have all the answers and we didn't have everything in place, we needed to start building an infrastructure for our members to report this as collateral so that when we did accept eMortgages, this would already be set and ready to go. Now, this was also important because we were getting feedback from a number of our members, our banks and credit unions, who were wanting to report eMortgages. They just didn't have a full understanding on how to do that. And so we saw and observed a few of our members who would originate an eMortgage and put that on their hard drive instead of an eVault. Or they would originate a wet inked loan, they would image that and call that an eMortgage. And so it became clear to us that we needed to put together an operational structure and path for our members who wanted to originate eMortgages. So we put together a number of working groups within the Federal Home Loan Bank system to tackle a number of the topics that were rising as we started to put this operational path in place. So we had a legal group looking at legal issues. We had a group focused on market valuation and the value of these loans. Because at the time, there was not a strong secondary market in place. There was a small secondary market for conforming loans, but most of the loans that come to us are non-conforming. So we wanted to make sure that we priced these loans accurately and competitively. We created a subgroup for the communications officers to make sure that we were putting a message out that was clear, it was uniform. We also were reaching out to MERS to talk about the e-registry and how we would interact with that. We talked about the types of e-vaults that we would have in place. We wanted to be known as a secured party in this endeavor and not the owner. So how would that work? And so we were also fortunate at this time to be able to participate in this North Carolina eMortgage Advisory Council, where we had a number of our members be a part of, and we also had other industry experts who were all telling us through this process, Home Loan Bank, you need to start accepting eMortgages as collateral. And then COVID-19 hit in March. And I'm sure we're all in agreement that this pandemic really stinks. I mean, it's been horrible in many ways, but it has absolutely propelled the demand for eMortgages to new heights. So where a number of our member institutions thought this was a good idea back in March, once this pandemic hit, then their customers started approaching them and demanding the ability to close loans at home. So I would say over the last 8 months, interest in eMortgages has skyrocketed. I have many of our members reach out to me, and it feels like almost a daily basis. They reach out and they say, we're actively talking about originating eMortgages, but we need you, Federal Home Loan Bank, to start accepting these as collateral. So those kind of comments get our attention, and we are actively and diligently working towards accepting eMortgages. So thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Kent. There is a lot more information available now than ever before on eMortgages. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions about eMortgages currently? And can you address some of the real challenges? Are things really as difficult as some people may think? Raj, I'll start with you. Can you tell us about misconceptions and challenges you've encountered?
Great question, Kelly. The first misconception that I can think of is that the confusion between eNotary and eNote. People equate eNotary with eNote. As a result, they tend to think that loans with electronically signed notes are possible only in some states. But Kelly, as you know, the reality is that electronic signatures on promissory notes are legal across all 50 states and DC. And another misconception that I can think of that is again connected to e-notary process is when people think of e-notary process, they tend to think of only remote online notary process. while remote online notary process is growing in popularity and is definitely a way to conduct contactless closing transactions, if a borrower and the notary desire to meet each other in person to conduct such a transaction, they can do so. This method is actually called in-person e-notarization. And from a system standpoint, lenders tend to think that they need to implement e-closing and evolve systems, but an increasing number of settlement agents and document custodians are rolling out e-closing platforms and e-note vault platforms. So while having their own systems provides a greater control on the transaction from a lender standpoint, I recommend lenders reaching out to their settlement agents and document custodians to see if their solutions can fit into the lender's process before they embark on implementing the technology on their own, because ultimately the approach of using somebody else's technology might save technology implementation costs. And then with regards to challenges that you asked, lack of seamless integration between loan origination systems and e-closing platforms create some inefficiencies in workflow from a lender standpoint. Just to give an example, Freddie Mac currently requires lenders to deliver a data attribute called eNote indicator when loan includes an electronically signed promissory note. And when a borrower opts out of the e-closing process at the closing table, lenders would have to go manually and remove the data attribute from the loan file because there is no integration between the e-closing platform and the loan origination platform. Another issue that creates inefficiencies in the workflow is lack of integration between document providers and e-closing platforms. Because of this reason, lenders would have to rely upon somebody else to manually tag loan documents for electronic signatures. And in cases where you find an integration between a doc prep platform and a e-closing platform, it's mostly one-to-one, meaning that lender would have to rely upon the e-closing platform that has integration with their doc prep platform, or if they really want to use a e-closing system of their choice, then they would have to change the document preparation system. And Freddie Mac is working very actively with various technology solution providers to address some of these challenges. Some other challenges I can think of, Kelly, are lack of options from a eNote servicing buyer market perspective, and also the transactional costs. Some lenders have expressed concern with the e-closing transactional costs, especially the ones that go through remote online notary process. Based on what I heard from them, it appears that the remote online notary fee is on top of a traditional settlement agent fee, making the process more expensive for both either the lender or maybe for the for the consumer. So again, there are some challenges. I must acknowledge those, but industry is working very actively to address some of these challenges. Back to you, Kelly.
Thank you, Raj. That was great. Shane, can you share some of your thoughts? And can you speak to the timeline for overcoming some of the challenges and how that may impact adoption?
You know, Kelly, I think as I think about sort of both misconceptions and challenges, I think Raj, touched a lot on some of the same things that I would say, particularly in terms of, some of the misconceptions that are out there regarding what can be signed, right? Notarization versus the note, it can only be RON, right? And I think I also agree as a misconception that lenders probably think too much about county and state acceptance for e-signing and e-recording. I think in general, I would say most states are allowing for this. Most populated counties have e-recording capabilities. As Raj mentioned, you can sign an e-note everywhere. So I'm not necessarily worried about that. And I do want to just say at this point, like, this is an important thing, particularly in North Carolina, because of the capabilities that the Secretary of State and others within the state have really been putting into place, right? Like, they saw early on that e-closings were going to be important in the state, and they took that leadership role. And I think that's important. Again, like, one of the things when we talk about to lenders is look at those states where, they're really focused on some of these things. And so I think that is where North Carolina has shown some of that leadership. If I think about some of the other misconceptions, though, I do think that, people think, oh, well, title and settlement acceptance, and there's always sort of this pointing of fingers back and forth between lenders who are saying, oh, it's title and settlement that's not ready, title and settlement saying, oh, it's lenders that aren't ready. And honestly, I think both groups, by and large, are really there. So that's one of the misconceptions that I think I would highlight. And then the last one, and again, Raj touched a little bit on this, is I think lenders are concerned too much about the difficulties or focus too much on the difficulties of implementing the technology. And from my perspective, the technology itself isn't the difficulty, right? So there is some technology you are gonna have to worry about integration. I think Raj touched a little bit about that, particularly thinking about between the LOS and the closing system. But for me, it's much more around the process, right? So understanding the workflow, understanding where do I have to put in processes and controls, right? We've had 40, 50 years to perfect sort of this paper-based process, and I don't think anyone would say that it's a good process, but at least we understand it. We understand what the processes and controls are. And so now we're introducing these new processes that are going to be different, that are going to require new ways to think about this. You have to think about being able to allow for both a paper or an electronic closing. And so that is going to take some time for people to think about that, but I don't think that the technology itself is the problem. And so then also when we think about some of the challenges, though, I will say that some of the same things that I said are misconceptions, I will also highlight are going to be challenges. So for instance, title and settlement acceptance of the closing processes. I do think that at the local level, at the independent, right, when you actually go to your closing and you're talking to your settlement agent, I do think at that local level, we do run into situations where someone either says, oh yeah, I have those capabilities, but they haven't even tried it, or once they get there, for some reason they may back out of that. And so I do think that there's more education that's needed at the local level to continue to bring people up to speed and get them used to doing these types of closings. I do think that there's a lot of adoption struggles that are in the industry, and by that I mean, a closing involves a lot of people, right? You have your realtors, you have your LOs, you have title, you have your warehouse lines, you're going to have servicing outlets. All of those stakeholders need to be involved as you're making these decisions, and so there is going to be the need for some of that buy-in, and so I do think that can be a challenge for people, and that's one of the reasons why when we think about readiness, when we think about adoption and implementation, we tell the lenders, go out, talk early to all of your stakeholders, make sure that they understand that you're doing this and that you're moving forward, because there is going to be the need for some of that adoption and some of those conversations. I mentioned, sort of the title integration, the updates to your workflow. That is the key piece from the technology, right? And Raj touched on that also. So I don't know that I'll go into a lot of that. But the last thing, and I think I touched on this earlier in the misconception, is you do need to rethink your processes and controls to be able to accommodate that bifurcated process, right? Like you need to be able to, if things are going along and you're assuming that it's going to be an eClosing, and at the last minute, either the internet connection isn't there or somebody, you can't do, for whatever reason, you're not going to be able to do the closing the way you expected, you're going to need to be able to switch over to paper and do that sort of on the fly. And one of the things that we've seen, one of the challenges is some of that communication between the title settlement community back to the lender, right? So being able to say, hey, this closed paper versus electronic. I know you thought it was going to close electronic. And then being able to report that, when you're selling that to an investor, either to an aggregator or to us. I think those are some of the things that I think we're still seeing some of those challenges, but those are just things that are going to get worked out, particularly as more and more people begin doing this.
That was great, Shane. Thank you. Kent, can you address where the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta currently stands in accepting eMortgages?
So great question, Kelly. Appreciate where we're at. Currently, the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta is looking at completing the infrastructure that I previously talked about and being able to lay out a clear path for our members so that when they want to report eMortgages, they'll be able to do so. And so remember that I talked about that we had observed a number of our members that didn't quite know how to originate e-mortgages. They wanted to do this, but it wasn't clear to them exactly how to do this. And frankly, that's to be expected when you have a brand new product in process. So to help our shareholders and the market establish best practices for originating and storing eMortgages, we, the Home Loan Bank of Atlanta, just completed a series of webinars for our membership where we laid out the nuts and bolts of originating eMortgages, how to interact with MERS, what's the best way to reach out and find an eVault and the importance of storing your mortgages on an eVault. We also talked about reporting eMortgages and having an operational requirements path that we'll have in place when we do start accepting eMortgages. Again, this is just to ensure that there's a standard process in place that everybody can follow. We also worked with the Mortgage Industry Standards Maintenance Organization, or MISMO, which is an affiliate of the MBA. And they were very helpful in helping us put together this operational path. And they were also putting together a final set of operational standards that all 11 home loan banks will use as they put together and start accepting eNotes. So again, these 11 home loan banks represent thousands of financial institutions across the nation, all of which hopefully soon will start accepting eMortgages. So we, the Atlanta Home Loan Bank, we're considering a pilot program here very soon, where we would allow a limited number of our members to take the eMortgages that they've originated and put it through our system. We want to test this infrastructure that we've built. We're very close to completing it, and now we want to test it. And so these limited number of shareholders would take their eMortgages and report those to us as eligible collateral. And we would test our system and make sure that everything that we've put in place is accurate. So assuming that this pilot program is successful, we'll likely go to our board for approval for acceptance of eMortgages at some point in 2021. Now, all 11 of the home loan banks are in various stages of accepting eMortgages. And I think it's likely that all 11 will be accepting eMortgages at some point in 2021. In fact, I know of a couple that are already accepting eMortgages. So as we start accepting these eMortgages as eligible collateral, I think the market's really going to take off, because what we're looking for here is a broad secondary market. It's real important to the home loan bank that we be able to give accurate and fair value. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that market, that secondary market, started forming pretty quickly. So bottom line, Kelly, the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta is getting very close to accepting eNotes as eligible collateral.
Thank you, Kent. I'm so glad to hear about the progress that the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta has made. Raj, is now the time for lenders to get on board? Can you speak to the benefits a lender can realize given some of the challenges we discussed earlier?
Kelly, I believe eMortgages and eClosings are going to be the new norm from a closing transaction perspective, because an increasing number of consumers are demanding speed and convenience. And eMortgages provide that speed and convenience for the borrower. Because with eMortgages, as you know, borrowers can create their electronic signature once and apply that signature to each loan document that need to be signed with just a click, as opposed to writing their entire signature on each page that need to be signed. Also, several lenders allow consumers to sign various documents ahead of the closing day. So combination of these two factors means that consumers are going to spend less time at the closing table. And if lenders use remote online notary process to conduct closing transactions, then borrowers have the option to conduct their closing transaction from a location of their convenience. In addition to helping lenders meet the borrower demand for speed and convenience, eMortgages also help reduce document processing and handling costs. With eMortgages, the borrower signed documents are readily available in the eClosing platform without having the lender depending on a settlement agent to ship a signed closing package. And lenders can begin their post-closing review process 1 to 2 days sooner than what is possible in a traditional paper-based closing process. And various electronic signing platforms also have controls to make sure the closing transaction is marked complete only after borrower has signed all the required pages or they have initialed all the required pages. So all of these factors together means that there will be less follow-ups required from a lender's perspective. There will be less follow-ups, that settlement agent need to respond to, and all in all, there will be a much better customer experience. And then for lenders that use warehouse funds to fund their loans, eMortgages save at least 2 to 4 days of warehouse line interest per loan because of the fact that lenders can deliver documents much faster to investors, and investors can use automated processes to certify loans. And from a servicer standpoint, eMortgages reduce the risk of losing note and any resulting delays in loss mitigation activities. And if remote online note technology is used to conduct closings, that can be a deterrent for borrower fraud because there is a audio video recording of the entire closing transaction. And from an investor or regulatory audit perspective, lenders can respond to those audit requests much faster because they can locate documents much quickly. Everything is located in a e-vault or maybe appropriate e-storage system, as opposed to maybe getting to document custodian and waiting for them to ship back documents, etc. So one thing that I did not mention when I talked about document processing and handling costs is with a traditional paper-based closing process, once a settlement agent sends the closing package back to the lender, typically lenders scan those documents and store in a electronic storage system. So the activity related to scanning and indexing is eliminated if lenders go with the electronic closing process route. So in summary, what I'm trying to say, Kelly, is that with regards to your question of it's time for lenders to get on board, my answer is yes, because e-mortgages offer several benefits that lenders can take advantage of it. I understand there are some challenges that I mentioned earlier, but e-mortgage ecosystem is in a much better shape than where it was a couple of years ago. And the challenges that we have right now are being addressed actively by various industry stakeholders. So I would say again, it's time for lenders to get on board. Back to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Raj. That is really helpful information for the lenders to know. Shane, we talked about some of the benefits for lenders, but from an investor perspective, what benefits have you seen?
Kelly, that's a really good question. If you're talking about, what's some of the investor benefits versus some of the lenders, I think in a lot of ways, the things that I would say from an investor perspective are going to mimic or mirror a lot of the things that Raj already highlighted. But for me, from an investor standpoint, probably the first important benefit is I can ensure that I'm getting 100% data match, right? So I know that all of the data in the note is going to match up to whatever was told to me at loan delivery. And that's really important to me, right? It means that I don't have to rely on any sort of manual verification. I know that I can cut out a lot of maybe post-delivery corrections, post-purchase adjustments, any of those things. I'm not going to have to do a lot of that because I'm validating and I'm verifying all of that information up front. That's really important from an investor standpoint. I think the second thing, and Raj talked a little bit about this, right? But our ability to be able to offer faster delivery and funding for our customers, right? Like I think that's huge. We're certainly following, some of our RESPA guidelines, which would mean that, we're dispersing funds, probably, 24 hours, 36 hours after closing. But at the same time, we're dispersing funds 24 hours, 36 hours after closing, right? And so, we've got lenders who, they're thinking about their processes and they're changing a lot of how they do things to be able to take advantage of those delivery and funding sort of timelines, right? And if you think about sort of what that means on a paper standpoint, right? Like in a paper process, You have to get the note. Maybe the settlement agent has to, the title has to send that back to the lender. Then the lender has to send that to the warehouse. The warehouse has to verify it. Ultimately, they're going to send it to our custodian. We're going to certify it. Just think about all those steps in the process and what that's going to look like from a delivery and funding standpoint. And we can eliminate all of that and make it so that transaction is easy. And so when we talk to our customers, I think that's certainly one of the key things that they would highlight as a benefit is some of the things that we're able to do. I think the other thing from our side, from an investor standpoint, is we're able to eliminate a lot of the loan certification issues that have come up, right? And again, as things go to a custodian, as we're doing some of that manual review, right, we can just eliminate all of that because we can automate all of that process and make it so that we know immediately as soon as the note comes in whether we're going to take that or not. And then the last thing, and again, Raj talked about this in terms of lost notes on the lender side and the risk and what that means for them. But certainly that's important for us as well, right? Particularly if you think about on the servicing side, maybe in a loss mitigation sort of situation, right? During the last crisis, that was one of the key things that we were worried about was, can we find the notes? Do we know where the notes are? You have to worry about some of that, servicing transfer, some of those scenarios. All of that just goes away, right? When we have an e-note, I know where it is. I always know who the owner is. I always know where the authenticated copy is, right? And so I don't have to worry about some of those same things that I had to worry about before with the paper note. So from a risk standpoint, again, as an investor, much stronger for us to be able to take advantage of that. So those are some of the thoughts that I had, Kelly, in terms of an investor perspective on some of the benefits as well.
Thank you, Shane. That's great information. Let's shift gears and discuss the eMortgage future for a bit. Kent, can you tell us what's next for the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta related to eMortgages?
So thank you, Kelly. Yes, here's what's next for the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta. So once we get residential 1 to 4 family loans approved as eMortgages and start to move and focus on that, then we're going to shift gears and start looking at home equity lines of credit, or HELOCs. After that, we'll look at commercial real estate loans, and then after that, we'll look at multifamily loans. Now, the commercial real estate loans and multifamily loans, they have a broader set of documentation, so that's going to be a little bit of a different challenge for us, but I know that we'll be able to handle that. And so that mix of going next to HELOCs and then commercial and then multifamily, that may change, that mix, but we will absolutely, when we get through with residential, move to the next one. We know that our shareholders, once they start down the path of accepting eMortgages, they're going to want to go fully down that path. So we're right there with them, and we'll start doing that. And then one of the other things that we've noticed and observed during this pandemic is that many of our members' borrowers have come to our member to ask for forbearance on their loans or for modifications on their loans. And so they've come to them to ask for help, but they've also said that they want to sign any related documentation to forbearance and modification electronically. And they want to do that from their home, from the safety of their home, the convenience of their home. So our members have come to us and have said, we've got a number of weddings loans that we need to issue a forbearance agreement or a modification, but we want to sign that electronically. And so we had so many of our members approach us that we said, okay, for any loans related to COVID-19, you can do just that. You can have those documents signed electronically. And our members came back to us and said, well, that's great. We appreciate that. But we want to be able to do that going forward for any loan. And so that's also a common question that's come across the system. And we're actively talking and looking at that and being able to allow that as well. And then looking further into the future, we're considering the use of artificial intelligence, or AI, to allow us to read loan documentation on a much broader scale. So right now, when our shareholders report loans to the Federal Home Loan Bank as collateral, then one of the things that we do is we look at the loan documentation behind those loans, and verify the eligibility of those loans. And it's a full set of documents that we look at. We look at the promissory note, we look at the mortgage, we look at any and all modifications, the title report, the appraisal. And the appraisal can be pretty large on a commercial real estate loan. So those are just the major documents, and we look at each of those. And because so many of our members report hundreds, if not thousands of loans to us, then we have to pick a small sample to look at and extrapolate what we find in that sample into the broader portfolio. But if our members held their documentation electronically, we could review those loan files quickly, remotely, and much more broadly. And this would save time, it would save money, and it would save effort, not only for the home loan bank, but for our members as well. So we see this as a tremendous advantage of having your loans electronically held. Now, having said all this artificial intelligence thought is still years away, but it's something that we're actively discussing and seriously discussing amongst all the home loan banks. So Kelly, we are very excited about the possibilities before us, and we believe that once we get rolling with accepting eMortgages, then this will be a huge boost to this product, and I would expect to see a much broader acceptance in the overall market.
Thanks, Kent. Raj, where do you see eMortgages going in the future?
$1 million question, Kelly. So as we know, lenders have been digitizing various parts of their mortgage origination process for quite some time. Things like income asset verification, employment verification, underwriting. So it's only a matter of time before they digitize the back end of the process, i.e., the closing, and then maybe post closing as well, right? So where do I see this going? I see more lenders implementing eMortgage or eClosing process, and each of these lenders may take some time to ramp up their production. Based on my past experience, lenders typically take maybe 3 to 6 months or maybe 6 to 12 months to ramp up their production, because they typically roll out eMortgage process to 1 or 2 markets and learn from the rollout and pick the process before they roll it out to all of their other markets. So that is definitely going to happen in terms of the continued rollouts, but volume, it may not be significant from each of these lenders in the near term. Right now, eMortgages account for 4 to 6% of overall mortgage production, and I would see in the next couple of years it is jumping anywhere from 8 to 10, maybe 12%. And the e-closing transaction itself is predominantly conducted, on devices like iPads or maybe on, laptops currently, right? An increasing number of consumers are conducting their transactions on mobile devices. So I'm not exactly sure what solutions are there, because when it comes to mortgage transactions, the documents tend to be multi-page documents, and because it's one of the most important transactions from a consumer standpoint, what is the solution we come up with has to be such a solution where consumers can still understand the loan terms and know what they're getting into before they sign documents. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Raj. Shane, can you talk about what is driving future growth? Are we going to get to the point where more than half of closings are being done electronically?
Kelly, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because it's one of the things that we've been talking about, particularly like if you think about sort of how our closing is going to be done electronically. How do we get to 25%, 30%, 50% of closings being done electronically? And we're asking that a lot, particularly because of all the volumes that have been generated in 2020. I don't think I'm saying anything coming at this strangely to say that 2020 has been an unprecedented year in terms of what we've seen, right? Like, I think we're all going to just kind of smile and nod at that. But I think one of the things that it also meant was we've seen volumes in 2020 that are historic level of volumes, right? And there was a lot of reasons for that. And so one of the things that we're starting to say is, okay, we know that eMortgages, that the eNote volumes have been driven to some extent because of the volumes that we've been, the origination volume. So does that mean that, as we go into 2021, 2022, are we going to see those volumes go back down? And I think my answer to that is no, I don't think that that's going to be the case. And the reason why is because of what we're seeing here in terms of the lender adoption and the lender benefits, right? Like as we talked about at the top, in order for lenders to really take advantage of the capabilities and to be able to do volume at scale, you have to be able to incorporate this into your processes. You have to change your workflows, right? You have to really go in, fully in and adopt these capabilities and assume that everything is going to go electronic. So if you're doing that, then I don't think that there's necessarily a huge ramp up to say that I'm going to go from 5% of my volume to 10% to 20 to 25% of my volume, right? Like once you start doing that, I think you're going to see within a year or two where people are doing 40, 50% of their volume, because that's just what makes sense from a workflow standpoint, right? And so I think that's one of the key things that I would say, and that's one of the key reasons why I think in the future we're going to continue to see those types of volume. I think the other key thing that we're seeing, and the reason why I'm optimistic about the volumes, is I think you're seeing more investors that are coming on board, right? Like, we've heard already from Kent about the work that the home loan banks are doing, what Atlanta is doing. We know that aggregators are coming in, that they're beginning to accept eNotes. They've been doing pilots, but again, I think as more lenders start to do this, I think you're going to see more and more of them looking for those aggregators, looking for those outlets beyond just sort of the GSEs. And then the last piece is, I do think it's important that Ginnie is coming on, and that Ginnie Mae is doing some of their pilots and are going to begin to securitize the eNotes as well. Again, just because if you think about it, if you're in a lender shop and you're doing maybe half of your volume is government volume, and then the other half is conforming, or 30-40% is conforming, you're going to want to be able to do everything the same way, right? Again, you want to avoid that bifurcation. And so I think by having these other investors coming on, by being able to have some of these execution options, that's just again going to make it so that we're going to see a lot more volume coming in. We're going to see those adoptions. So honestly, I'm very sort of optimistic on what we're going to see and the volumes that we're going to see. And so I don't think we're going to see sort of this dramatic sort of drop in eNotes next year. I think we're going to continue to see some of that growth that Raj talked about at the top. Does that make sense, Kelly? Any other questions or anything in that regard?
I would like to thank our panelists for their participation today. Shane, Raj, and Kent, thank you so much. Your industry perspectives have provided valuable information for our participants today. Let's take some questions from our audience and see what they have to ask about eMortgages.